Okay. In a sense, I'm not going to say anything new today, but I think there's a danger of losing the forest in the trees. We've been looking at a lot of specific arguments of specific results, and I haven't really talked about how I see it all hanging together since the beginning. So that's what I want to do today, and put into context the things that we did, so you can see sort of where details of the matter, and mostly where they don't, where it's enough to know that there sort of is a construction like this, is an argument like this, that this sort of thing can be done. The overall title of this course was Philosophy of Language. I've been giving a view about what language is and something about how it works. And the first thing that's distinctive about that view is that it's reason-centered. The notion of reasons is the fulcrum around which that I'm using to try and do some work on language. I'm interested in the structure of reason or reasons and in the function of them. And we can look at that from a number of different points of view. But let me mention first that, as you know, the notion of reasons is something like coeval with philosophy in the Western tradition. Philosophy begins with the ancient Greeks puzzling about this peculiar force of the better reason, which on the one hand is not compulsory. Someone can simply reject reasons, say, no, I don't care what arguments you give, here are my convictions. On the other hand, there's another sense in which they are compulsory. They have a genuine force. And philosophy really begins, I think, with the challenge to understand that character of reasons, that peculiar force of the better reason that in one sense is not compelling, but in another sense is. And it was here that the model of the arguments in Euclid's Elements was so important for the origin of philosophy, the sense in which if you accepted the premises, you had to accept the conclusion, or the worry that people who were not moved by that were in some sense less than people, that being moved by that peculiar force of the better reason was part of being the kind of thing we are, or maybe just the kind of thing we want to be. In the idiom I'm using, what was peculiar and puzzling about the force of the better reason is it was a normative force. But how do you tell a story? How do you tell a story about that? And in contemporary philosophy, I could easily, instead of talking about the view I'm interested in as a reason-centered approach to thinking about language, talk about it as a reasons-first approach. I don't, because that term already has a developed use in contemporary philosophy for a view in practical philosophy, where I'm concerned here more with cognition and theoretical philosophy, but that view in practical philosophy that the way into understanding normativity in general is through the notion of reasons is very much of a piece with the view that I'm concerned to pursue. And this seeing reasons as at the center of language, insofar as language is philosophically interesting, is a way of filling in, or anyway is suggests a strategy for justifying Michael Dummett's claim that philosophy of language is first philosophy, that it's in some sense at the center of the discipline. And here I'm motivated by two views about the relation between reasons and language. And the first is what we might call pragmatic rationalism. And that's the idea that the way to demarcate discursive practices from non-discursive practices, ones that are Sprachspiele in Wittgenstein's term, is through thinking about the role of reasons in them. That contrary to Wittgenstein's own claim, language does have a downtown, and it's something like practices of giving and asking for reasons, of challenging and defending claims. So one aspiration is to use the notion of reasons to pick out language as a phenomenon, to distinguish social practices that are discursive, linguistic practices from the rest. And the second is the semantic inferentialist idea that conceptual contents, things that can be believed or claimed or thought or known, ought to be understood at base in terms of the role things play in reason relations. That conceptual contents are something like roles in reasoning. This is another kind of rationalist thought. It's, I would claim, how Spinoza and Leibniz thought about contentfulness. And it pairs well with the pragmatic rationalism, this semantic inferentialism. But these are two crucial functions that one can appeal to the notion of reasons for: demarcating the linguistic, and then using it to understand contentfulness of what is sayable, thinkable, claimable. And if you're not motivated by either of those ideas, it's possible that the rest of my project is not going to be interesting to you. But if it is, if you think there might be some go to those ideas, then it becomes important to be able clearly to characterize what reasons are. I've suggested putting that in terms of what reason relations are. And here, if you look at the other things I've said this term, you might be puzzled because I haven't put forward a substantive view about what's a good reason for what. I haven't put forward a substantive view about what good reasoning is. Bayesians will tell you, well, reasoning rationally is reasoning according to these principles that will give you conditionalization, updating your credences, and so on. Here's our substantive view of what being rational is. And that view in thinking about theoretical reasoning, which is parallel in a way to the what I've called the logicist's view, that says good reasons are logically good reasons, reasons where there's a deductively good argument from the premises to the conclusion. Those are substantive views about what good reasons are that are meant to feed into something like a more capacious view, substantive view of rationality, like rational choice theory, that says to act rationally is to maximize utility, combining probabilities and preferences in the way they do. And I've said nothing like that. I've given a structural and a functional account of the role of reasons, but it's been completely abstract. At no point have I said anything about sort of who's right or what it means for something really to be a reason for something else. The level of abstraction that I've pursued in the project I've been describing this term is so abstract that the notion of a vocabulary that I use, a lexicon plus a set of reason relations. The lexicon's just a set of sign designs. The reason relations, that's the guts of the vocabulary. Well, we started off, it's a set of sequence of two kinds, implications and incompatibilities. But by the end, in the preferred implication space semantics, it's just a set of pairs of sets of lexical items. That's just a relation in the algebraic relation structure sense. And where you ask a traditional logician or philosopher of language who's influenced by traditional logic, well, of relations, sets of pairs of something or other, what makes them reason relations? They'll say, oh, the structure. Since the 30s, we've known that reason relations have this closure structure. They're transitive, they're monotonic, they're idempotent. But I've denied that. I've said we should be working with the notion of reason relations that doesn't globally impose any of those structural conditions. Indeed, in implication space semantics and NMMS, the logic that it is sound and complete with respect for, both of those will work with notions of reason relations that have no global requirements on their structure. They're just, the sets of reason relations are just sets of pairs of sets of sentences. And now it can look like the notion of reason has gone completely missing. Okay, I call these reason relations, that's the label I used for them. I've called them implication and incompatibility, but what makes them reason relations and not just relations? And what motivates the story I've told this term is an answer to that question. It's what I call discursive metarationalism. It's a kind of second order functionalism, according to which to be reason relations, in the sense that can play those two crucial roles that I mentioned a minute ago, to demarcate discursive practices as one's articulated by reason relations, and to define useful notions of conceptual content. We're talking about sentences, so it's propositional contents as roles that sentences can play with respect to reason relations. I've suggested that we think about what we mean by reason relations as what plays a certain role now in rational metavocabularies. That is, vocabularies whose principal function is to express reason relations. I've mentioned pragmatic, rational metavocabularies, which specify the reason relations in terms of the use of base vocabularies, logical metavocabularies that, again, express reason relations, representational semantic metavocabularies, and conceptual role semantic metavocabularies. Here, the key notion is one of rational metavocabulary. Metavocabulary that gives us the capacity to make explicit in the metavocabulary some feature of the reason relations of a base vocabulary. And I'm suggesting that the discursive metarationalist suggestion is that there's a constellation of rational metavocabularies, pragmatic, semantic, and logical in general. There's some more fine structure, but those are basically the ones. And to be reason relations is to be expressible, explicable in all of those kinds of rational metavocabulary. That's the second order functionalism. Rational metavocabularies express reason relations. Well, we can turn that around if we can independently specify these kinds of metavocabulary. Then we can say reason relations are what they have in common. And we can understand the reason relations in terms of the relations among what's expressed by these different kinds of rational metavocabulary, pragmatic, semantic, and logical. That's the discursive metarationalist explanatory strategy. Each of those kinds of rational metavocabulary expresses the reason relations, makes them explicit in a different way, using a different kind of reason relation at the meta level. And those reason relations better qualify in that, we can talk about the use of, we can apply a pragmatic metavocabulary to a semantic metavocabulary, for instance. But each of those rational metavocabularies makes explicit reason relations in a different way. And in that sense, defines a different perspective on, or aspect of, or dimension of reason relations. And I'm suggesting we understand reason relations as what those are all perspectives on, what the pragmatic, semantic, and logical metavocabulary, rational metavocabularies are perspectives on. So, this includes being characterizable in terms of their use in a pragmatic metavocabulary, in terms of their meaning in semantic metavocabularies, and in extensions of the base vocabulary by introducing logical vocabulary. If we look at the mandala of rational metavocabularies here, what I'm calling discursive metarationalism is the view that we should understand the reason relations at the center there functionally in terms of how the pragmatic, semantics, and logic are related to it. I'll just mention, to file away for future reference, that the directions of the arrows connecting those are important. Logic is elaborated from and expressive of reason relations. You have the reason relations, and you can talk about them in logical terms, introducing conditionals to make the implications explicit, negations to make the incompatibilities explicit. But pragmatic and semantic metavocabularies seek to explain what reason relations are. They want to tell us what it means for one thing to imply another. Pragmatically, in terms of the way the expressions are used, semantically, in terms of what they mean in the paradigmatic case, in terms of how they represent the world to be. What it is, we're going to explain semantically what it is for an implication to be a good implication. Well, for instance, in the truthmaker semantics, by saying an implication of A by gamma is good in case the fusion of any truth maker of all the elements of gamma with any false maker of A is an impossible state. If that's so, then the implication holds. And the pragmatic account, the corresponding version we've seen, says an implication of A by gamma is good in case commitment to accept all the elements of gamma together precludes entitlement to reject A. Or the position you're in, if you're committed to accept all of gamma and committed to reject A, is out of bounds in the bilateral original version. Those are meant to be substantive explanations of the reason relations. Logic, if we understand it in the expressivist way I've suggested, doesn't pretend to do that. It just pretends to let us say that an implication holds or an incompatibility holds. That's what I meant to indicate with the directions of the arrows, that we're to understand reason relations in terms of what we can say in a pragmatic or a semantic metavocabulary, where the logistical tradition thinks of logic as having an arrow in that direction too. It's going to tell us what a good reason is, but I've suggested that's the wrong way to think about logic. Logical metavocabularies are, in this sense, non-explanatory. They're fundamentally different from pragmatic and semantic ones. They can explain what it is for an implication to be logically good or for an incompatibility to be a logical contradiction, but those aren't the relations of implication and incompatibility that can perform this dual function of distinguishing linguistic from non-linguistic practices and letting us understand conceptual content as role with respect to those reason relations. So if you look on the handout here, discursive metarationalism, a reason-centered approach to conceptual content and discursiveness. Pragmatic rationalism, going to use that to use the reason relations to distinguish discursive practices. Semantic inferentialism, we're going to use them to understand the notion of content. That explanation is that demand, that aspiration, I'll say, to use role in reason relations to understand conceptual contentfulness is why I haven't offered, and I'm not interested in, substantive notions of good reason. Because those notions all, I want to say necessarily, presuppose the conceptual contents of the things they're characterizing in terms of good reason relations among them. So if we think about the most general rational choice model, we need to already know what the outcomes are that we have preferences to find over. We have to understand the differences and the content of the outcomes, where I say I prefer this outcome to this other one. And we have to already understand, we have to treat as already contentful the practical options, where I'm trying to decide, should I do A or should I do B? But I have to understand what doing those is in order to begin to apply the rational choice apparatus to decide how to maximize my utility, the measure of preference over those outcomes by picking some option. I think I mentioned in passing at one point during the term my pet peeve of the political cliche, failure is not an option. Yes, idiot, it's not an option, it's an outcome. It's an outcome. You can't choose one or the other, though. The whole point of this framework is to distinguish and relate those things. But like, I think, Bayesian notions, which of course feed into the rational choice picture, just because they're substantive notions of good reason, they're not eligible to perform this explanatory semantic function of articulating the contents of things as roles in reasoning, because they presuppose the contents of the things they're characterizing substantive rational relations between. So the semantic inferentialism sets the aspiration to tell a story of that shape, sets pretty severe criteria of adequacy on one's account of reason relations. And it might seem that when you've given up the aspiration of having a substantive notion of reason relations, and you've given up commitment to strong structural constraints picking out reason relations, that you've left yourself nowhere to go. But the discursive meta-rationalist strategy says, no, you can think about reason relations in terms of the role they play with respect to rational metavocabularies, vocabularies that make explicit what we can then see as different aspects of or dimensions of reason relations, and so conceptual contents. Okay, let me stop there. This is a very general characterization. I've said very little about the specific kinds of rational metavocabulary, but these are distinguished from other kinds of metavocabulary, syntactic ones or phonological ones, which are also, there's some base vocabulary that they let us talk about, but it's not the reason relations of those base vocabularies that they let us make explicit. And so they're not going to be part of this second order functional account of reason relations. So let me stop there to invite comments or questions about that overall strategy. I mean, I said something about that the first time, but way back at the beginning of the term, but we didn't know anything about rational metavocabularies of different kinds at that point. I'm talking about using that particular constellation of metavocabularies as a functional definition of reasons to get at their structure and function. Anything anybody wants to say about that? Okay, well, if you look at the outline, I want to rehearse briefly the different kinds of rational metavocabulary, and so the different perspectives on reason relations that they have, the pragmatic metavocabularies, the logical metavocabularies, the paradigmatic, truth-based, model theoretic representational semantic metavocabularies. Our example has been the most sophisticated, contemporary, hyper-intentional truth-maker semantics of Kit Fine. And then what I argued is the intrinsic implication space semantics for characterizing conceptual roles, and the bimodal conceptual realism that relates pragmatic and semantic metavocabularies, as well as the intrinsic implication space semantics. And here I think we're in a position, having sort of been through all of these, to notice some things about the relations among these metavocabularies that we weren't in a position to notice before. So if we look at the pragmatic metavocabularies, I mean, I hope by now these points are familiar. The first claim is that to be a discursive practice is to be a practice in which you can say that things are thus and so. You can make claims. So we want to understand what it is to make a claim. Sentences are going to be things whose utterance has the default significance of a claiming. That's how we're going to get our vehicles. And the first sort of substantive claim that I made about claimings in a pragmatic metavocabulary is a bivalent one, that claimings essentially come in two flavors, assertions and denials, expressing practical attitudes of acceptance or rejection. Now, acceptance or rejection of what? Well, those claimables, that's what the semantic inferentialism tells us we should understand in terms of its role in reason relations. So far, all we can say is black box, what's expressed by sentences, the sentences that are asserted and denied. Parenthetically, though it's no part of my story to do this, you can think of those practical attitudes of acceptance and rejection as taking true and taking false. The notions of truth and falsity are buried inside that taking operator, that, you know, these are virtual notions, objects of attitudes. But if you want to understand what tempted people to think about meaning in terms of truth and falsity rather than in terms of reasons, that's an important thing to remind yourself of. Now, not everybody thinks that claiming is the essence of discursive practice. I take it that when Wittgenstein said language has no downtown, he would have he meant to be rejecting inter alia, the idea that in order to be a discursive practice, there must be performances in that practice that the practice accords the practical significance of claimings to, of assertions and denials. And indeed, many of his Sprachspiel don't have any performances in them that have the significance of claimings. The slab Sprachspiel at the beginning of the investigations, for instance, does not. And I've argued that, anyway, draw the conclusion from the perspective I'm articulating here, that those are really vocal practices, but not really verbal ones. That to be discursive practices, something should have the significance of a claim. We should not understand the commands in the slab Sprachspiel as imperatives. They don't have the meaning, bring me a slab, because nothing can, except in a context where you can also say, this is a slab. You can't say, shut the door, except in a context in which you can say the door is shut. You can produce noises, the appropriate response to which is to bring somebody a slab. But that's related to real commands, the way mere labeling is related to describing, just on the side of commands. So that privileging of claiming as demarcating the discursive, that's a substantive philosophical commitment. And the second substantive philosophical commitment here is about the critical rational character of claiming practices. That to be intelligible as claimings have to be part of a practical whole that includes their being subject to rational challenge and in need of rational defense. Where challenging is going to be making claims that serve as reasons against the claim, and defending is making claims that serve as reasons for the challenged claim. And I'm saying you're not going to be able to understand the moves people make, the performances they produce as claimings, unless you see them as part of a practice that involves these critical rational practices of challenging and defending. And I've suggested, and this is a big theme of the opening chapters of Making It Explicit, that we can only understand that it's a consequence of that critical rational demand, that we can only understand discursive practices in a pragmatic metavocabulary that is deontically two-sorted. It's got to distinguish commitments and entitlements. In particular, it's got to make two sorts of distinctions. What are you committed to versus what you're not? And which of those commitments are you entitled to? And maybe what are you entitled to that you're not committed to? Claiming is then understood as undertaking a commitment. It's the entitlement to that commitment that is challenged and defended. And I've suggested that the base form of those practices has to relate those with what I call the default and challenge structure, that you count it as entitled to the commitment until and unless somebody challenged it. And then to retain that entitlement, you need to defend it. That's what I've characterized as the game of giving and asking for reasons. Now, so here's a connection between the pragmatic rationalism that wants to demarcate the discursive in terms of it's incorporating practices of giving and asking for reasons. Now we see how that can be connected to the privileging of claiming in demarcating discursive practices via this critical rational this claim about the essential critical rationality of practices of claiming. If you go that far with me, then we can understand reasons pragmatically, the pragmatic account of reasons as a matter of transmission of entitlements. I said we can understand challenges as making claims, and defenses as making claims. In the stripped down practice, all you can do is make claims. But some of those claims have the significance of challenging others. Some of them have the significance of defending others in context. And we can describe that, if we like, as giving reasons for and giving reasons against. And now we get our first glimpse of the reason relations. I say, well, for gamma to be a reason for A is for it to imply A. And for gamma, so a reason for, in the sense that you could defend your entitlement to A by committing yourself to accept gamma, and similarly for incompatibility. And at this point, since we're working in this two-sorted deontic pragmatic metavocabulary, we can appeal to a version of Thirestall-Ripley bilateralist normative pragmatic understanding of implication. We can generalize that to include incompatibility. This is the elaboration I've done following at work from Ryan Simonelli from the Roll Group, saying that a sentence gamma implies A, just in case commitment to accept all of gamma precludes entitlement to reject A, and a set of sentences gamma is incompatible with a sentence A, just in case commitment to accept all of gamma precludes entitlement to accept A. And we can say that if commitment to accept all of gamma precludes entitlement to reject A, then it implicitly commits you to accept A. It's not the same as you're asserting A or you're actually adopting the practical attitude of accepting A, but it's the only move available to you. You can stay out of the game, but that's what makes it an implicit commitment. And I think one of the helpful things about thinking about that notion of implicit commitment is we can then understand inferring as an activity in this practice as explicitly acknowledging what you're implicitly committed to accept or reject. When you assert what is implied by what you have committed yourself to accept, that's making an inference. When you reject what is incompatible with your commitments to accept other claimables, that's making an inference. So I think we get a satisfying picture of the core discursive practice that we're then going to see others built on. Yeah, Hassan.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I guess we must have covered this before when we spoke about it, but something you said just struck me a little strangely. So you, right, inferring is drawing or acknowledging explicitly what one's implicit commitment. I feel like there's a sort of a pre-theoretical pull in a different direction, though, which it feels like when I infer a conclusion that I'm committing myself to it. It feels like that is the sort of creation of the commitment in some way.
Well, I mean, I hear the
Yeah.
bit of practice that you're sort of appealing to there, but this notion of inference is meant to articulate that notion of the force of the better reason. So, I've committed myself to accept everything in gamma, and now that implies that I can't be entitled to reject it.
Mhm.
So implicit in that is that by committing myself to accept gamma and thereby precluding myself from being entitled to reject it, I've implicitly committed myself to accept it. Implicit in the sense that it's sort of implied. But I haven't done that yet. So what happens when I do acknowledge the force of the better reason, acknowledge the implication? Well, that's when I say, okay, so A, I'll assert A then. You were saying, well, it seems like there isn't really any commitment there before. I say, well, there isn't. There's just that you have reason to.
Yeah.
And the inference is acknowledging commitment to what you have reason to be committed to. That's the intuitive sense I'm after.
Would it be fair to say that, like, I guess the way I was thinking about it before is that, like, there's a notion of commitment which we understand independently, and then that can be explicit or implicit. It's not like that. It's not like it is a commitment, but just implicit. It's like the explicitness or implicitness is like, they're really different senses of commitment in a way, or something.
That's true. Okay. Yeah, that's absolutely true. Okay. I mean, and you might simply not like that idea of implicit. You might say, no, I just want the ones where, that involves your accepting it, and so under suitable circumstances being prepared to assert it, or rejecting it, and so being prepared to deny it. This connection between the practical attitude and the speech acts, and there's an end on it. So, I mean, this addition of the notion of implicit commitment and the corresponding notion of inference, that's an optional superstructural addition to the sort of core practice. Of course, I like it because it's the pragmatic reflection or echo of the notion of explicitation of implications just as reason relations, where we talk about the content of a premise set. We're sort of on our way to a conceptual role semantics. We say, well, the explicit content of the premise set gamma is just the sentences that are in gamma or what they express, but its implicit commitment is what it implies. And explicitation is now exploring the consequences of moving that thing that's merely implied and is part of the implicit content in the literal sense of what's implied into explicit position, adding it as a premise and seeing how that changes what's implicit in it. That's the explicitation claim. So, I'm charmed at any rate by the parallel between what you can say in the pragmatic metavocabulary and what you can say in a sort of vocabulary of pure reason relations. So that's all a story in a pragmatic metavocabulary about what reason relations are. Right? In terms of commitments and entitlements, it's explaining what implication and incompatibility are. And it's starting from a notion of giving and asking for reasons, that is, from a notion of rationally challenging and defending claims, and deriving a notion of reason relations from that, explaining the notion of reason relations, in terms of what we're doing when we make claims and give and ask for reasons for them. That's the pragmatic explanation of reason relations. And we'll see that's very different from saying by implication, I mean something about the possibility or impossibility of fusions of truth makers and false makers, or in a simpler model theoretic semantics. No, by implication, I mean that the set of possible worlds that makes all of gamma true, the intersection of the sets of possible worlds that makes each of its elements true, is contained in the set of possible worlds that makes A true. That's what I mean by implication, and a corresponding story about incompatibility. That's a semantic story about those reason relations. And of course, one of the things we're interested in is the sense in which they're talking about the same thing. They're talking about reason relations of implication and incompatibility, and giving us different perspectives on it, or making explicit different aspects of it. This is going to be how we understand what reason relations are, and so how we understand what conceptual contents, which are articulated by those reason relations, are. That's the suggestion. The discursive metarationalist suggestion is that we understand the reason relations and the conceptual contents articulated by them by understanding how these different kinds of rational metavocabularies work. And so far, I've only rehearsed the pragmatic one. And remember, I suggested that because there are these explanations, pragmatic and semantic, not, I'm claiming, a logical explanation of them. Logic's relation to them is different. Because there are these two, there's potentially competing orders of explanation. A pragmatic's first order of explanation that says, look, understand what reason relations are in terms of what you can say about them in the pragmatic metavocabulary. And another one that says, no, understand them in terms of what's made explicit in the semantic metavocabulary. In each case, we're going to want to know why it's also possible to talk about them in the other metavocabulary, but at least those two different orders of explanation show up as available. Okay, let me talk about the logical one, the logical metavocabularies, though for my purposes, oh, I'm sorry, yeah.
Can I, not if this is a bad time.
Nope.
This is, I guess the question is just, could you elaborate on the distinction between denials and challenges? So you came in saying that there are two fundamental moves to be made in discursive practice, the claim versus the denial. It seems to me that is, if that's a pragmatic take, I fail to see why it wouldn't be the claim and the challenge, since it seems to me that you can, like, the challenge is broader than just the denial. The claim denial distinction seems to me to be bound up with a semantic perspective, right? Since you can challenge an expressive commitment, you can't deny it. So this seems to drag stuff down to a semantic level. Is that right, or is this just an uninteresting terminological issue that I'm bringing up?
I want to say neither one. That is, when we're talking about claimings, and I've suggested that the core of discursive practice can be a practice, that sort of stripped down version can be a practice in which all you can do is make claims. That is, assertions and denials expressing your acceptance and rejection, but some of those can stand to other ones in this relation of being challenges or defenses. So we wouldn't have any sort of merely expressive boo hurrah, say, utterances. And it's part of the sort of declarativism or assertionalism here to say, and this could be an autonomous discursive practice that had only claimings in it, whereas there is no such, in principle, there is no such autonomous discursive practice that has only optatives or expressive utterances in it. They're part of the suburbs already, and there's a very strong claim, and it's at least a clear thing to mean by discursive practice this way. But at the level of claimings, I'm saying making a challenge to a claim that is accepting a claim can be thought of as giving reasons against it or as giving reasons to deny it. Those are the same thing at this basic level. A reason against an acceptance is a reason to deny it. It's only implicitly a denial, right? That's what we get from seeing a reason for. Well, let's say a reason against. So you make a set of claims gamma that are incompatible with A. That's giving a reason against it in the sense that commitment to accept gamma is precludes entitlement to accept A. So that's implicitly a reason to reject A, and so to deny A. So if we want to go back and forth between reasons against accepting and reasons for denying, we're going to need this notion of implicit commitment. But that's a very tight structure in what I'm describing as the core discursive structure. And the sort of first thing one might want to say is, well, what if we loosen things up there? What if we allowed some things that where that equivalence didn't hold? And what would be the expressive function of doing that? But absolutely we could. I think that's what I want to say. Okay, so I want to quickly remind us of the view about logical metavocabularies, but then nothing that I'm going to say after that is really going to involve the logic. I'm going to put that to one side. Logical metavocabularies are really the odd one out in this discursive metarationalism. They're essential, but they're not engaged in the same enterprise that pragmatic and semantic metavocabularies are. And the way to understand that, I think, remember I introduced these metavocabularies with two different attitudes you could have about the relation between logic and reasons. The tradition, the logistical tradition, says, oh, logic tells us what good reasons are. Logic provides a substantive theory of good reasons. It is in the same business as pragmatic and semantic metavocabularies. It's going to explain what implication means. It means derivability in a logical system. It's going to explain what incompatibility means. It means implying an inconsistency. Good reasons means logically good reasons. True, we logicists don't know how to say anything about practical reasoning from that point of view. We're just talking about cognitive or theoretical reasoning, but there good reason means logically good reason. And something like this was an important strand of the project of analytic philosophy during the first 50 years of that movement, was a challenge to attribute covert logical form to sentences in such a way that you could reproduce reason relations among those sentences as logical derivations once you had the deep logical structure correct for those expressions. So this is why Russell's On Denoting is one of the key documents and banner achievements of this project. He says, definite descriptions in ordinary language, we make inferences from them. They have a distinctive role in reasoning. And look, if we say that below the grammatical structure, there's this logical structure that claims that there is one existential claim and there is only one, then we can, as a matter of logic, derive some of the consequences, some of the reason relations that expressions with definite descriptions in them stand in. And the thought was, oh, that's great. Now let's do that for probabilistic discourse and normative discourse and so on. And that has not worked out. I think it's fair to say. But that was, a colorable project. But another way to think about the relation between logic and reasons is that we start with material incompatibilities and implications, that is, ones that articulate the content of non-logical expressions. So Princeton is to the east of Pittsburgh, so Pittsburgh is to the west of Princeton. That's not a logically good inference, but that's a good inference is part and parcel of what east and west mean. If we think that we can make sense of reason relations without mentioning logic, maybe pragmatically, anybody who's committed to Princeton being to the east of Pittsburgh is precluded from being entitled to reject the claim that Pittsburgh is to the west of Princeton, and thereby, and in that sense, is implicitly committed to accept that. If we tell a story like that, or a semantic story about what these reason relations are, where we say, well, the reason Pedro is a mammal follows from Pedro is a donkey is that all the possible worlds in which he's a donkey are possible worlds in which he's a mammal. That's what we mean by follows from. It's a matter of set theoretic inclusion relations among sets of possible worlds. That's our semantic account. If we have a notion, and it has nothing to do with logic, just about donkeys and mammals, what would make those claims true, how the world would have to be. If we can tell those stories, then logical expressivism says the function of logical vocabulary is to come in and make explicit in an extension, in a regimented extension of the base vocabulary, make those reason relations explicit. Let you say that all donkeys are mammals, or that if something is a donkey, then it's a mammal. That being copper is incompatible with being solid at 2000 degrees C, by saying if it's copper, it follows that it's not solid at 2000 C. So on the expressivist view, logic is an expressive tool for talking about reasons generally. The order of explanation is from reason relations that you already have, whether you understand them pragmatically or semantically, to the capacity to say what follows from what and what's incompatible with what, using conditionals and negation. I mean, let me say parenthetically, sort of all philosophers end up teaching logic to undergraduates at some point, and propositional logic is derided as baby logic. We haven't even gotten into modality, never mind first order quantifiers and identity. Truth table, how complicated could it be? Well, there's a lot to be done just at the level of sentences. I hope that's sort of become clear, particularly once one appreciates that if we're going to be expressivists about logic, then we can't assume that the reason relations our logic is going to make explicit have the nice, tight, tidy structural properties that are characteristic of specifically logical implication and incompatibility, namely monotonicity, transitivity, idempotence, and so on. Tarski and Gensen pointed out that logical implication and incompatibility have these properties. If you ask them what they mean by a reason relation, they'll point to these structural properties. And one of the reasons I think that the ship of the analytic philosophical project foundered, one of the rocks that it wrecked itself on is that logical relations of implication and incompatibility, where, I've said properties of implication. For incompatibility, it is that if you've got two incompatible commitments, there isn't any difference between what they imply and what they don't. They explode. Negation is an explosion detector. Everything follows, so nothing follows. All bets are off if you've got incompatible commitments. Well, the reason relations that they were trying to reconstruct by imputing a deep logical structure and then hoping to exhibit the reason relations of the surface locutions as covertly logical relations. The trouble was that the reason relations they were trying to reconstruct didn't have that structure. They're open structured, not closure structured. And it's by no means the case that if you find yourself with incompatible commitments, that it means you're committed to everything, or you can't distinguish between what follows from what. That just isn't the way it is. But if instead of being logicists, we're logical expressivists, our logics have to be able to handle those base vocabularies that have substructural, open structured reason relations. And that is not a task for a baby logic. You need to work hard to get a logic that can make those explicit. And it's a triumph of our project to show that the NMMS, which is really just a non-transitive supraclassical logic. It's like the contemporary logic ST, strict tolerant, which is a multi-valued logic, except we use reversible Ketenin rules. And that pays off handsomely in Dan Kaplan's expressive completeness result for NMMS. Anyway, if you're a logical expressivist, you've got this job of work to find a logic or a set of logics that can codify substructural reason relations. And I suggested that codify, we can make that notion of logical expressivism more precise by talking about the property being of one vocabulary being LX for another, elaborated from, that's the L, and explicative of, that's the X. Elaborated from just means we're going to extend the base vocabulary, and all we need to know are what the reason relations of the base vocabulary are in order to determine the base, to determine the reason relations of the logically extended vocabulary. That's a non-trivial job of work, particularly if the reason relations you're starting with are substructural, but that's the elaborated from. And then there has to be a clear sense in which the logically complex sentences let you say that certain reason relations hold. And here the things to keep in mind are these conditions here. That didn't work very well. That here's a sense in which the conditional codifies implication, that gamma implies the logically complex sentence A arrow B, just in case if you added gamma to A as a premise, B would be a consequence. I talked about a converse downward conditional last time, but not baby logic to make that work. Indeed, I can't do it, as I sit here. And negation codifies incompatibility in the sense that gamma implies the logically complex sentence, not A, just in case gamma is incompatible with A. And that's a clear sense of letting you say in the logically extended language that A implies B in the context gamma, or that A is incompatible with gamma. Now, let me mention the logical vocabularies make reason relations explicit. What the implication space conceptual role semantics does is make conceptual roles explicit. The roles that things play with respect to reason relations, the roles that sentences play with respect to reason relations of implication and incompatibility, that's what you can make explicit in implication space semantics. So it's the difference between the reason relations and the conceptual roles or conceptual contents, which, according to the semantic inferentialist commitment at the beginning, we're to understand in terms of functional roles that sentences can play with respect to reason relations. So there's two different levels there. And, genuinely long story short, we present this NMMS, non-monotonic multi-succedent sequent calculus that is LX for the reason relations of any base vocabulary, no matter what structure it exhibits. And furthermore, Dan was able to show a very powerful expressive completeness result for it, that for any set of base sequence implications or incompatibilities, you can say exactly what set of logically complex sequence must hold in any base vocabulary where those base sequence hold, and vice versa. You can go back and forth between them. So in that sense, everything about the every feature of the reason relations of the base vocabulary can be made explicit by a set of sentences in the logically extended metavocabulary. Now, if we think about the second-order functionalism of discursive metarationalism, the claim is going to be that it's an essential feature of reason relations that you can make them explicit with a logical metavocabulary. Just as it's an essential feature of reason relations that you can specify those reason relations in a pragmatic metavocabulary of a certain kind. But if you couldn't make them explicit in a logical metavocabulary, that is one that is LX, well, the claim is a proper logic, and MMS is our candidate, can make explicit the reason relations of any vocabulary, whether it's an autonomous vocabulary or not. And so if something cannot be, if some set of relations cannot be made explicit by a logical metavocabulary, it's not a set of reason relations, it's just a set of relations. So for instance, the relations we would express in a phonological metavocabulary are not reason relations, and the logic, your conditional negation, are not going to help you make those relations explicit. The reason relations of a phonological metavocabulary, those we can make explicit, but not sort of what it's saying. So logical metavocabularies play an essential role in the constellation of rational metavocabularies that I want to use functionally to pick out reason relations. But as I said before, having said that, sort of all the action is really, I think, with pragmatic and semantic metavocabularies. So that's what I want to talk about next. But before I pass on from that breathless survey of what we said about logic, anything anybody wants to say or ask about the logic? Okay. So at some point I talked about these two philosophical traditions in the philosophy of language that we see over the last 120 years or so. A formal semantic tradition that starts with Frege, is continued by Russell, the Wittgenstein of the Tractatus, Carnap, Tarski, Quine, Lewis, Kit Fine, that's modeled on mathematical calculi of the sort that Hilbert, the formalist, taught us to think about. It's essentially monological. It's just a calculus where you do things. It's a monologue, not a dialogue. It's heavily mathematized, and its first fruits have always been a semantic understanding of mathematical and logical vocabulary. And the challenge has always been to extend that to other expressions. So, for instance, the move in the modal revolution of the 60s and 70s from Kripke's giving possible world semantics for modal logical vocabulary to, in the second wave, people like Lewis and Stolniker and David Kaplan showing how to extend that apparatus to give possible world semantics and intentional semantics for non-logical expressions, to talk about donkeys and mammals and so on. That was a substantive move that had to be made. That's one tradition. And another tradition is an anthropological sort of pragmatist tradition. We could put the classical American pragmatists, maybe particularly Dewey here. I would argue the Heidegger of Sein und Zeit, the Wittgenstein of the philosophical investigations, Quine when he has his two dogmas hat on, who think about language as part of the natural history of creatures like us, and think about social practices and language as an aspect of those social practices, dialogic instead of monological, no particular mathematical grip on things, thinking about us as the kind of creatures that talk, and understanding talking in terms of things creatures like us can do. These traditions have typically had very little to say to each other within professional philosophy. We can see them as focused, the first one on meanings and the second one on use, to use Wittgenstein's way of putting this. See the first one as talking about what you can say discursively. What are you saying? When you say something, oh, you're representing the world as being this way. You're taking it that the actual world is within this set of possible worlds, not this other one. As opposed to a tradition that talks about what you're doing when you're talking, making moves in a game of giving and asking for reasons, playing Sprachspiel. These two traditions have had very little to say to one another. Synthesizing them is an open challenge, fitting adequate formal semantics inside a pragmatist framework, or appending to, building on some formal semantic apparatus, an adequate pragmatics that says what it is to use expressions so as to associate with them uncountably large sets of abstract objects or possible worlds that we're not causally connected to. It's a job of work to give a pragmatics to say how you have to use an expression in order thereby to institute this connection with the semantic interpretance of it. What I'm calling the discursive metarationalist explanatory strategy synthesizes these perspectives by thinking of the relations between them in terms of the relations between semantic and pragmatic metavocabularies, focusing on the way they express reason relations. It says pragmatic and semantic metavocabularies are essentially, and not just accidentally, rational metavocabularies, that is, vocabularies for codifying reason relations, the reason relations that articulate conceptual contents according to the inferentialist picture. And we should understand the different aspects of now specifically reason relations that they make explicit in terms of the way these metavocabularies work. And we're going to understand reason relations not just as something that essentially can be made explicit with logical metavocabularies, but also as something that to which it's essential that they can be made explicit both in a pragmatic metavocabulary and in a semantic metavocabulary. What those reason relations are can be explained in terms of how you use expressions, and it can be explained in terms of what those expressions represent, how they take the world to be. And those are both equally essential features of reason relations, along with being expressible in logical metavocabularies. That's the discursive metarationalist hope. And here, an index result is O'Flobel's isomorphism at the level of reason relations between finds truthmaker representational semantic metavocabularies, codifying the meanings, what you're saying with linguistic expressions on the one hand, and bilateral deontic normative pragmatic metavocabularies, codifying the use of expressions on the other hand. And here, the parallel remember, is a definition of consequence, and there will be an echo of this for incompatibility as well. In the truthmaker semantics, which, let me remind you, is not one of the ones that Fine himself uses, though the ones he uses are definable in terms of this. They codify the external logic, for which this is the internal logic, if that's helpful. Logic on the side of premises in particular, and the logic on the side of conclusions. But this is a perfectly good thing to mean by consequence in the truthmaker framework. Gamma implies delta, if and only if every fusion of truth makers of all the elements of gamma with false makers of all the elements of delta is an impossible state. What makes truthmaker semantics hyper-intentional is it's distinguishing not just truth makers and false makers, but also multiple impossible states. And in the pragmatics, gamma implies delta in the bilateral normative pragmatic metavocabulary, just in case the combination of commitments to accept all the elements of gamma, the premises, and the commitment to reject all the elements of delta, the conclusions, is out of bounds. Or, as I prefer to say that in the more articulated pragmatic metavocabulary, it's a position or set of normative status as a set of commitments that one cannot be jointly entitled to. And in terms of this isomorphism, we can see how the very same reason relations of implication and also of incompatibility can be explained and specified in pragmatic terms and in semantic terms. Anything you can say in the one, you can say in the other. And I suggested that metaphysically, this is a way of making definite, a way of operationalizing conceptual realism. Thought of as the view that McDowell expresses by saying the conceptual has no outer boundary. Wittgenstein, when we say and mean that such and such is the case, we and our meaning don't stop anywhere short of the fact, but we mean this is so. Things are thus and so. In the Tractatus, the world is everything that is the case, the totality of facts, not of things. Facts are things you can say. Frege, a fact is a thought that is true. What's connecting the isomorphism between the specification of reason relations in a normative pragmatic metavocabulary and a representational semantic metavocabulary, that isomorphism to this conceptual realism is nothing other than the semantic inferentialism that says conceptual content just is role with respect to reason relations, which we can now see, we can specify either in the representational semantic metavocabulary or in the pragmatic normative pragmatic metavocabulary. Those are the same conceptual contents. And bimodal conceptual realism is the claim that the very same conceptual contents that are specified in the alethic modal semantic metavocabularies, remember, impossible is alethic modal vocabulary, crucial role in defining consequence relations in the truth maker, as are defined in the deontic normative pragmatic metavocabulary. So what I'm working up to is this new pretty picture of the truth maker alethic modal semantic metavocabulary for specifying meanings, and the bilateral deontic normative pragmatic metavocabulary for specifying uses, what you're doing and what you're saying. The reason relations between them can be just the same. We've got the global isomorphism that tells us how to map the one onto the other. This is bimodal conceptual realism because we have alethic modal semantic metavocabulary and a deontic normative, two different kinds of modality used in specifying these, conceptual realism. And what I'll talk about after our break, hovering above them with bright wings is Dan Kaplan's intrinsic implication space conceptual role semantics for specifying the conceptual roles that are roles with respect to reason relations, what's common to the reason relations that are common to what you can say in the semantic metavocabulary and what you can say in the pragmatic metavocabulary. So this triangulation on reason relations is what that second order functionalism of the discursive metarationalism tells us to concentrate on. So to explain this further, I have to talk about the conceptual role semantics, but why don't I do that after the break? I have 2:34, so let's come back at 2:49. Okay, so I have two more sort of themes I want to hit before I sum up. But before I do that, are there comments or questions at this point?
Yes, Prophet.
Yes, Ken.
And can I ask a question about the conceptual realism? I think there are different kinds of forms of conceptual realism, and I think it's also different kinds of forms of views about facts, and I wonder what's the difference? I think the view from the inferentialism is special or different from the view from Wittgenstein or Frege. So I want to ask, do you agree with the view of them, or there's difference between this?
Okay, good. Yeah, I mean, there are all sorts of differences, and would we knew just what Frege or Wittgenstein had in mind, or as far as that goes, John, who does not endorse my account of conceptual content in terms of reason relations, but also does not feel moved to provide an alternative account. That's not the line of work he understands himself to be in. And my guess is that he's together with Wittgenstein in that. And it's a good question whether so I think Wittgenstein and McDowell both use, appeal to a notion of the conceptual having no outer boundary, the content grasped in the mind being, when all goes well, the state of affairs in the world, that isn't backed up by or further articulated by a theoretical account of what those contents are. Now, the later Frege had one. I'm not sure how much use it is to us today. His third realm of senses is where facts resided not in the objective realm of truth values and objects. The young Frege, I think, would have resonated to this inferentialist way of filling it in. But it seems to me that one of the advantages of a broadly inferentialist approach to conceptual content, that is, understanding it in terms of role with respect to reason relations, is that we can make a rather definite version of a conceptual realism. And that's what I'm most concerned to do. Once that's, as it were, sitting still, then I invite other people who are tempted by the conceptual realism to compare and contrast it with this sort of bimodal reason relation based conceptual realism. But I'm not really in a position to do that because I'm trying to find some way to make definite what that tantalizing thought is. So, here's my candidate for conceptual realism. No, that isn't what everybody means, but just what they mean, not so sure. So, the two themes I wanted to go on to hit are, first of all, the implication space semantics, which I suggested stands to conceptual roles as logic stands to reason relations in a certain way. It's built on a base vocabulary in the way the logical metavocabulary is. It reflects the underlying reason relations and conceptual contents rather than trying to explain them as the pragmatic or semantic versions do. It's just doing it at the level of functional roles defined by these relations rather than of the relations themselves. But let me remind you briefly how this works, because again, I'm worried about the overall shape of it getting lost in the technicalities. So Kaplan starts with a space of candidate reason relations. We know how to code the incompatibilities into the implications. We do it by having an implication with an empty right side, meaning that what's on the left is incoherent. And that means anything from there that you move over to the other side of the turnstile is going to be incompatible with it. So we can define that. So we can just talk about sequence. And one of the things that's special, one of the breakthrough moves that he made is instead of starting his semantics with sentences, he starts them with sequence. And none of us inferentialists had ever thought of this before. We thought of the semantic interpretants as implications, but not what was semantically interpreted. We took it for granted that those were sentences. And I mean, eventually we have to semantically interpret sentences, but he started with the idea of both the semantic interpretants and what's interpreted being implications or candidate implications. And we have a distinguished set, which is very like, isomorphic with, finds distinguished set of states that are possible states or impossible, it doesn't matter. It's a partition. Kaplan starts with a partition of the candidate implications into the good ones and the bad ones, the ones that hold and the ones that don't. And then semantically interprets sequence, semantically interprets implications by associating with each implication the set of other implications that represent its range of subjunctive robustness. So if we think about it in a single succedent system, we associate with gamma implies A as its semantic interpretant all the other implications of the form delta implies A, such that gamma together with delta implies A is a good implication. So if gamma implies A is already a good one, then the empty set, then the implication, the empty set to the empty set will be one we can combine with it. Sorry, the empty set to A will be one we can combine with that. But basically, we're interpreting a sequent by the set of all the premise sets that you can conjoin with that and get a good one that either keeps this one good or would make it good. This is the implicational equivalent of truth conditions. What other premises would make this a good implication if you added them in there? But everything is just sets of sentences. And then at a completely separate level, he can interpret sentences as the set of all the good implications in which that sentence appears as a premise, and the set of all the good implications in which that sentence appears as a conclusion. I meant to mention way back when responding to Nikki's question that it is part of this picture of what claiming is, that sentences have to be able to play the role both of premise and conclusion in implications. And one way to relax that, to get more kinds of expressions, is to get things that can only be premises or that can only be conclusions of inferences, but can't play both roles. Things you can give reasons for, but that can't themselves be cited as reasons, or the other way around. But talking about the claimings, we basically have the premissory role and the conclusory role, a set of good implications in which the sentence A appears as a premise, and a set of good implications in which it appears as a conclusion. And on that basis, so he says, that's my representation of the conceptual role of that sentence, is that pair of sets of good implications, which determines the incompatibilities that it's in. And on that basis, he can give a sound and complete semantics for our NMMS logic, but also for any of the other metavocabularies or base vocabularies that we've got. That semantics doesn't build in any structural assumptions at all. It's universal. So I claim on that basis that we can see the intrinsic implication-based conceptual role semantics as codifying the reason relations and the conceptual roles that are roles with respect to those reason relations, that are articulated by those reason relations, which are what the global isomorphism shows common to what we express in the truthmaker semantic metavocabulary and what we express in the bilateral normative pragmatic vocabulary. So we've got a unity there, conceptual content, which we can specify in the conceptual role semantics, the implication space semantics, and we can explain those conceptual roles and the reason relations that articulate them in two different ways, with the truthmaker semantic alethic metavocabulary or the bilateral deontic pragmatic metavocabulary. So that's what's supposed to justify this picture, you'll remember, that has the reason relations in the middle of this tetrahedron, that has the logical, semantic, and pragmatic metavocabularies for base vocabularies. At its base, that base just is the mandala of rational metavocabularies, but has sitting above it the implication space conceptual role, meta-vocabulary, if you like, because it specifies the conceptual roles of all of them. So I would also claim that in this second-order functionalism, discursive metarationalism, that seeks to understand reason relations as what essentially can be specified in a whole constellation of different rational metavocabularies, that not only is it essential they can be specified in a logical metavocabulary, and essential that they can be explained in pragmatic and semantic metavocabularies, but also that the conceptual roles those reason relations confer on sentences can be specified in the implication space conceptual role metavocabulary. So we're putting multiple necessary and, I'm individually necessary, and I'm going to claim jointly sufficient conditions on being a set of reason relations and therefore a set of conceptual contents. Now, that's what's common to all of this. That's why the reason relations are the core of the discursive, and what all these now 4 kinds of metavocabularies are alike in making explicit. What we can see, the reason relations and conceptual roles that we can see is having different aspects or dimensions by our seeing how they look, how they show up when they're expressed from the perspectives provided by these different kinds of rational metavocabularies. But well, I think that's a satisfying story about what's common about the reason relations and the conceptual roles. We still might have the question, well, how should we understand the relation between what's expressed in a normative, pragmatic metavocabulary that has its explanation of what implication relations and incompatibility relations are on the one hand, and what's expressed in the semantic representational alethic modal metavocabulary on the other. It has an explanation of what relations of implication and incompatibility are. And those explanations are not the same. They're couched in different terms, but they are not the same. And it's here where it seemed to me we could get throw some light on the situation by turning the crank on our conceptual machinery one more time and giving an account, a bimodal account of the descriptive representational dimension of conceptual content. That's the dimension that the truthmaker semantics or its earlier model theoretic predecessors have. That's meant to fill in a part of the story that Fine doesn't fill in, which is explaining what the relationship is between a sentence and some states of the world, in virtue of which those states of the world are truth makers or false makers of that sentence. Presumably the answer is something about how it's used. And we have a story about how things are used so that, how sentences are used so that they stand in certain reason relations and so express certain conceptual contents. But we need to hook that up somehow with the truthmaker apparatus. And here in the last couple of weeks, in weeks 11 and 12 of the seminar, I talked about how we could talk about this representational aspect of reason relations or dimension of reason relations, that they represent the way states in the world are. And here, rehearsing the history of the notion of representation, I said, look, there's 2 aspects to this. It's a holistic notion but it has an alethic modal sort of tracking aspect that if what's represented were different, the representing of it would be different. And a normative aspect that what's represented exerts an authority over representings of it that count as representings of it, just in virtue of being responsible to it, where to what's represented, where we can understand that in terms of the represented serving as a normative standard for assessments of the correctness of the representing as a representing of the thing that serves as the standard for assessments of its correctness. I think this is basically a Kantian idea, though it takes some work to extract that. But I suggested that what we mean by saying that some set of things represents some set of other things is that the one subjunctively covariantly tracks the other. That's something that we can express in subjunctive conditionals in an alethic modal vocabulary, and that the thing that's being tracked normatively governs the representings in the sense of serving as a normative standard for assessment of the correctness of them, so that we could understand the sense in which ordinary empirical descriptive base vocabularies represent ways the world is by saying, well, they covariantly track it and it normatively governs assessments of the correctness of them as representings, and that those are expressed in our two metavocabularies, the deontic normative that we used in our pragmatic metavocabulary and the alethic modal that we use in our truthmaker one, so that we can use these very metavocabularies to understand the relation, the truth-making relation, the representational relation of reason relations that is made explicit by truthmaker ones. Now, exactly how this goes, a nice question, but I spent the 2 weeks trying to say something about that. And for now, I just want to put that on the table as part of the story. So that reason relations can stand in these relations of covariant tracking and normative governance, that reason relations specified in the one sort of vocabulary can stand in this representational relation to reason relations specified in the other. That's going to be a crucial part of the discursive metarationalist, second-order functionalist account of reason relations. And for now, it's more important that you see that I'm claiming that than just exactly what the content of that claim is. This is how that discussion from weeks 11 and 12 is supposed to work in there. So I want to say various things in conclusion. I mean, the conclusion of this last bit here is that this account of the descriptive representational dimension of conceptual content, that is, of reason relations and the conceptual roles they articulate, shows how both the normative government of representings by representeds that's expressed in the deontic vocabulary used to express the use of expressions, and the subjunctive covariant tracking of representeds by representings that's expressed in the alethic modal vocabulary used to discuss how the world represented is and must, and the subjunctive covariant tracking of representeds by representings that's expressed in the alethic modal vocabulary used to discuss how the world represented is, we can see how both of those must and can connive to institute reason relations for which that global isomorphism holds. So in the end, this is to be the story about how those pragmatic and semantic representational metavocabularies can be seen as specifying the same thing. And where that gets us, I mean, this is aspirational. This is what the discursive metarationalism aims to achieve, is here on the last page of the handout. Every vocabulary is a form of consciousness because it's a constellation of reason relations that lets you say or think something. It confers conceptual content on things. What it is to be conscious of something is to be able to make claims about it. There's the representational dimension. Consciousness is being able to respond to things by applying concepts to them. And every vocabulary defines a set of concepts because a vocabulary is a lexicon and a set of reason relations. And that means that every metavocabulary is a form of self-consciousness because it's a way of articulating the reason relations in the base vocabulary, for which it is a metavocabulary, that is a form of consciousness. It's a way of becoming conscious of the concepts in virtue of which you're conscious at the base level. And I've been focusing on the rational metavocabularies, the ones that make explicit reason relations. Well, they're forms of rational self-consciousness, forms of self-consciousness of the reason relations in virtue of which any vocabulary can let you become explicitly aware of anything. So discursive meta-rationalism that's looking at the relations among this constellation of rational metavocabularies, the pragmatic and semantic, the logical and the conceptual role semantics, is an account of the internal structure of rational self-consciousness as such. And now I've unpacked each of these terms. I said what I mean by rational self-consciousness, but that it's rational self-consciousness, that self-consciousness via those core reason relations, the ones at the center of the pyramid there, and they have a definite structure that's set by their relations to the vertices of that pyramid. And the way of working out discursive meta-rationalism that I've described is specifying that internal structure of rational self-consciousness as such. And it turns out that that structure can be specified in considerable mathematical detail. We can do the logic and the meta-logic of the logical metavocabulary. We can prove all these theorems about the relations between pragmatic and semantic metavocabularies, the global isomorphism there. We can prove then that the conceptual roles that are common, determined by that isomorphism at the level of reason relations, can be expressed adequately in the implication space semantics. We can prove that. This is a mathematical articulation of the internal structure of rational self-consciousness as such. Not to say that there isn't a lot more to fill in, but this is a remarkable prospect, it seems to me. And you may or may not remember that I started my story in the first week of the semester, talking about another pair of traditions in the history of philosophy. We can sum them up under the distinction between Natur and Geisteswissenschaften, or between Erklären and Verstehen, where hermeneutical thinkers, paradigmatically, Wilhelm Dilthey at the end of the 19th century said, look, discursive formations, language and things that can be said or thought are a fundamentally different kind of thing in the world than the kind of thing that's studied by the natural sciences. Languages, vocabularies, concepts aren't like bits of matter whizzing around in the void, or even like living things. They're fundamentally different and need to be understood methodologically in a fundamentally different way than things that are not discursive formations, that don't have the form of texts can be understood. You are not going to understand them by trying to explain them from first principles in the way that has turned out to be so fruitful in the natural sciences. That's the explanation, erklären. There's a different kind of understanding, verstehen, that's needed for them. And it's roughly a translational or interpretational method. The only way to understand these things is by mapping them on to your own thoughts and texts. And this is the method, the hermeneutic method of interpretation. So this Verstehen tradition was anathema to the Vienna Circle. They say, no, understanding is scientific understanding. That is the form of understanding things. I don't know, the Benjamin Jowett, the legendary Platonist, was master of Balliol College at Oxford, and his slogan, widely reported by his students, was, "I am the master of this college, and what I know not is not knowledge." And he didn't know anything about science and didn't think any of his students needed to either. Well, that's something like the view the Vienna Circle took, only from the side of science. They said, look, this is understanding, and you can understand in principle anything that way. That's why the prospect of a scientific semantics from Tarski was so exciting for them. The Verstehen folk had said, look, language is a very different kind of thing from the things the natural scientists study, and sufficiently different that it requires a different methodology for studying it. So they thought, we can't use mathematical and algebraic tools to explain it. We have to use these interpretive translational tools instead. And I think they were right about its being a distinctive topic. Vocabularies, reason relations, you have to, they're unlike anything else that's studied scientifically. Sufficiently different that we need a different methodology. The Verstehen folk were right about those. But I don't think they were right in concluding that we couldn't use mathematical algebraic tools to understand it. I just suggested we can study using mathematical tools the internal structure of rational self-consciousness as such, of vocabularies as vocabularies, because we can understand reason relations in the second order functional discursive metarational way, and the mathematical tools at a meta vocabulary level are very useful. And in insisting that we use interpretive translational tools instead, I think the Verstehen people mistook a criterion of adequacy of understanding vocabularies for a method for achieving an understanding of it. The measure of understanding what somebody said is indeed whether you can map it on to your own vocabulary in such a way that you can have a productive conversation. But it doesn't follow that there aren't ways of doing that that go through, for instance, mathematical appreciation or characterizations of rational metavocabularies that articulate the conceptual contents of the vocabularies we're trying to bring into discussion. Okay, there's one last point I would like to make about what's expressed by the semantic and pragmatic metavocabularies in particular. As I said, I think that suitably filled in the account of representation relations as having essentially an aspect, the normative governance side that's specified in a deontic vocabulary, and essentially a subjunctive covariant tracking aspect that's specified in an alethic modal vocabulary. I think that's going to give us a satisfying account of the way in which those two means of specifying reason relations, the deontic pragmatic account of use and the alethic semantic account of what it is about the world you're representing that makes these the right reason relations, how they can connive and relate to each other, the difference that is the bimodal part of the conceptual realism. They're specifying the same conceptual contents. But there's a potential question left over, anyway, among the many potential questions that's left over, is the Kantian Copernican question, which, when translated into this framework that I've been sketching here, can be thought of as a challenge to say which features of the reason relations of our ordinary empirical descriptive base vocabulary, the one that talks about copper and about east and west and about donkeys and mammals, which features of those reason relations are to be understood or explained as due to our practices of using expressions in Kant's idiom, that is, which features of our experience are as they are because of features of our subjective cognitive faculties. I'm saying that translates into this framework by asking what features of the reason relations of implication and incompatibility are as they are because our practices are the way they are, because of the norms that are implicit in our discursive practices, because of what we're doing on the one hand, and which features of those relations of consequence and incompatibility, of inclusion and exclusion, are the way they are because of the way the world is, because of what actually follows from what actually excludes what in the alethic modal sense. How the world we're talking about. So, notoriously in the original Kantian case, he took himself to have discovered that the spatiotemporal and causal character of our ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary is properly understood to be explained by features of our practices. Well, our abilities, capacities, faculties of representing, that is, are to be pragmatically explained rather than being taken to reflect features of the world that's represented, that is to be explained semantically in our current terms. I mean, it is tempting, I think, to ask this question, a version of this question: what feature of our reason relations, which features of them are as they are because of what we do, specifiable in a pragmatic metavocabulary, and which are as they are because of features of the world we're talking about, representing covariantly and being normatively governed by. Because some features of vocabularies that we can make explicit using metavocabularies clearly are not reflective of the way the world is. You know, the world is not in English. It doesn't depend on the particular constellation of sounds that our combination of tongue, teeth, and palate can make, or that we're set up for, say, right-branching grammars. None of those features of vocabularies are reflective of features of the world we're talking about. But notice, all of those features I've mentioned, the sort of phonological, the having to do with the sign designs, the syntactic, those all get lumped together under what I've called the lexicon. They're not features of the reason relations. It's the reason relations that are made explicit by rational metavocabularies. And the Kantian question properly is addressing those. It says these reason relations of consequence and incompatibility that we see as at the center of the discursive that's made explicit by this distinctive constellation of metavocabularies. Which features of those reason relations are as they are because of what we do, and which are as they are because of the way the world is? And from this point of view, that pragmatist, broadly anthropological tradition said, oh, all of them are as they are because of the meanings, the conceptual content we've conferred on them by using these expressions as we are. And the semantic tradition equally answered all of them. All of them, all those reason relations, what follows from what rules out what, are as they are because of the way the world we're talking about is. A matter of what the melting point of copper really is and what kind of creature donkeys really are. I think that the Kantian Copernican question, addressing that question, I think that's a mug's game. The temptation to think that they can't both be right about that should be resisted, not indulged in. The rational metavocabularies make explicit aspects of the reason relations, which are determined by how we use expressions in the world and representing the world that we do use them in. And it actually doesn't make sense to try and assign some features of them to our practice in that world and others to the world in which we're practicing. And it seems to me a proper an adequate discursive metarationalism would show us that that's true and why that's true. Why that Kantian Copernican question transmuted into the framework that I'm addressing, why that question actually doesn't make sense. But showing that would require further analysis, a further account that would support an argument I don't have. And I don't know how to offer such an analysis, construct such an account, or make such an argument. But that's the challenge that I'd like to leave you with. I think that Kantian Copernican question does have an analog. The question seems to make sense in transmuted into this very different framework, but that I would claim is addressing the same issues that Kant was addressing, at least a large overlap of them. And it seems to me a criterion of adequacy of our understanding the unity in difference that is the reason relations, different aspects of which are made explicit, are expressed explicitly by the different kinds of rational metavocabulary, to understand the necessary unity that necessarily is expressed in this diversity, this particular diversity of rational metavocabularies, related as they are. If we really understood that unity as the product of these diverse perspectives, of what those diverse perspectives are making explicit, then it seems to me we should be able to see why the Kantian Copernican question is a bad question. But as I say, I'm not in a position to explain that or argue for that now. Okay, well, that's where I would like to leave you. It's in medias res. We're still thinking about these things. Indeed, I put in the supplementary materials for this week. Only this morning, you're not supposed to have looked at it. A note that Ulf contributed to the logic group just this week that's suggesting a conceptual improvement on the implication space, conceptual role semantics. So all of this is ongoing. Last week, I talked about some projects that are unfinished. Wanted to convey this time the overarching vision of that I've called discursive metarationalism, a way of understanding what reason relations are, in a way very abstractly, but in another way quite definitely, by the role that those reason relations and the conceptual contents that they articulate play with respect to this distinctive constellation of rational metavocabularies. So that's what was meant to be invoked by the mandala of metavocabularies of reason, of rational metavocabularies at the beginning. And I've tried various pictures since then. Okay, well then, please go forth and be discursive beings and engage in discourse with metavocabularies of all different kinds. And I will see each of you going forward.